Well, hello and welcome back. I'm Justin Briley. This is Unbelievable, the show that brings you conversations that matter, and you can get weekly dialogues and debates via our podcast too. And sign up to our newsletter and you won't miss a thing. Plus, you'll get a free ebook featuring some of my favorite conversations with people like Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins and Tim Keller. There's links to the show and the newsletter in the description from today's video. So do like and subscribe if you enjoy it. Well, today on the show, we're talking about the Jesus of Islam and Christianity. Can we reconcile the two? Mustafa Akyol and Richard Shumack join me on the show today. Mustafa Akyol is the author of The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. In it, he claims that the first followers of Jesus never believed in him as divine, and that when Islam emerged in the 7th century, it reclaimed the original vision of Jesus as a prophet. Richard Shumack is the author of the recently published book, Jesus Through Muslim Eyes. In it, he calls for Muslims and Christians to embrace constructive disagreement. For although Muslims and Christians both revere Jesus, he says the Jesus of Islam points down a different road to that of Christianity. So Mustafa and Richard, thank you very much for joining me on the show today. Well, let's start with you, Mustafa. As I understand it, you grew up in an Islamic environment, but you've long stood against extremist forms of Islam. And I think some of your books in the past have pointed out that you believe it's perfectly compatible for Islam to coexist peacefully with Western Enlightenment values and so
on. First of all, thank you for the show. And I was looking forward to have a conversation with Richard, whose work I appreciate, and he looked into my book and raised some criticisms, and I'm looking forward to hear more. And it's a pleasure to be on the show. Well, first of all, I should say that I'm not even arguing that early followers of Jesus didn't believe in his divinity. I'm just pointing out that there was a division in early Christianity between followers of Jesus with a higher Christology and a lower Christology. And those groups with the lower Christology who considered him maybe as a Jewish Messiah or as a son of God, but not in still the full divine sense, found themselves in history as heretical branches of Christianity, like Arianism, and also Jewish Christianity, which is, we know from the writings of church fathers, in the 3rd, 4th century. So, and I'm just pointing to the similarities between them and the image of Jesus that happened in Islam. I mean, we'll talk about this more probably today, but I just wanted to put that out. But
Sure.
Regarding myself, I'm from Turkey. I grew up in Turkey and from Istanbul, my hometown. And yes, I've been critical of extremist or intolerant or authoritarian interpretations of Islam. I believe we have issues in Islam to deal with, like the bans on apostasy, blasphemy, some elements of Islamic law. And I think we need to reinterpret certain things. But once we do that, yes, the core of Islam as the belief can be and is at its core compatible with an open, free society. But we have to work some issues, as Christians did, during the 17th and 18th centuries, and the Catholics even later. And I even find some inspiration in Jesus for that quote unquote reform in Islam, because Jesus, one thing he did, I mean, historically so phenomenal, was as a Jew, he looked into the halakha, the Jewish law, and he proposed a more spiritual interpretation of it rather than blind literalism. And I think that's quite relevant for discussions in Islam today.
And do you feel like that if Muslims and Christians especially, and Jews I suppose, can come to more of a coexistence on who Jesus was, that itself will promote more peaceful coexistence generally in the world?
Well, I mean, there will be disagreements between these three religions for sure, like any religion. And I think Richard is right to point that out, and I'd like to hear more. But I want to still show that besides those disagreements, there are some bridges of understanding. Regarding the two great religions, Islam and Christianity, in terms of their population in the world, I think there's something very interesting. On the one hand, these religions both highly revere Jesus and Mary. These are the two religions actually, show such a high respect for Jesus and Mary. Islam defines, the Quran defines Jesus as the Messiah, as the Word of God. These are very, very powerful concepts. accepts the divine birth, the virgin birth, and that is pretty powerful, and even tells Muslims to be following Jesus, to emulate the disciples. Of course, on the other hand, Islam takes a very strong position against the doctrine of Trinity and the idea of the divinity of Jesus. And these are there, and these will not diminish. But I wanted to show in my book to both sides that there are at least some nuances that maybe we might be missing. For example, when the Quran denounces those who say God have a son, Muslims generally take it to mean Christianity. But when you look more carefully into those verses in their Arabic, they're using the word veled, which is a biological son. So the Quran was born in an environment where pagan Arabs believed in gods with carnal, families and relationships and wives and sons and daughters. So the sonship of Jesus is something different from that. So I'm on the one hand calling Muslims to understand those nuances, that some of the Quran's reactions might be towards paganism more than Christianity.
Okay.
On the other hand, I'm telling Christians, well, look, we have an image of Jesus, and it is not totally unfounded, when you look into your own tradition as well.
Well, we'll obviously get you to unpack the thesis in a little more detail in just a moment's time, and see what Richard has to say in response to it. But let's just have an introduction to Richard as well. You're a philosopher of religion. So what brought you into actually getting so deeply into the issues around Islam specifically, Richard, in your studies?
Yeah, wow. Well, thanks, Justin and Mustafa, for this conversation. My background, actually, I worked in refugee ministry in Australia for many years, and it just sort of happened that the people who we were serving were Muslims from the Horn of Africa, Somali, Ethiopian, Eritrean, and it was just fascinating to me that when Muslims and Christians, at least the Christians and Muslims I was with, had conversations about anything really, but particularly about faith, they just tended to talk like that. They talked past each other. Seemed to me that just the mindsets, the frameworks were very different. Muslims and Christians were answering questions that the other person wasn't asking, and the conversations didn't quite compute. So that sort of led me into trying to work out what that was. That led me into philosophy, worldview. So I did a PhD at University of Melbourne. My specialty is actually Muslim philosophy. So that was my background. I just wanted to see people talk better, like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad we've got you on the show for the first time. So tell us a little bit about where that's led you in terms of this latest book. I mean, I know that Mustafa comes up, but it also covers other ground as well. So tell us a little bit about some of the various things you're trying to do with Jesus through Muslim eyes. Yeah,
sure. So you're right. Mustafa's book is like a catalyst, if you like. But my book's, it's not like a rebuttal or a direct, it's nothing like that. It's just, it was a catalyst thinking, yeah, right, the figure of Jesus is enigmatic, and as Mustafa was saying, Muslims, there's a devotion to Jesus and a much, much richer tradition, if you like, within Islam than most Christians would imagine. Not just in the Quran as well, through all the traditions, through the early traditions around Muhammad, the Hadith, and the sayings of Muhammad, but then later on devotional material developed. And there's also been a range of different sort of Muslim positions on Jesus as well. So just try to help people understand that, and then I use that as a way of opening up discussions about who the real Jesus really is.
Great stuff. What's your aim in your book? What do you hope that both a Christian or a Muslim reader might come away with by the time they've finished it?
Yeah, well, if anyone sees my book, it sort of starts with a bit of a story about how, like, I didn't put my faith in Jesus until I was an adult at university. And so for me, it was this sort of process of discovering Jesus. And then I would much later on, met Muslim friends who were saying, well, that's not Jesus, this is Jesus. And so for me, it's really a quest for the historical, the true Jesus. And this is a bit of a discussion around that. But I also agree with Mustafa that sort of the impetus to want Muslims and Christians to get along well as they have that discussion. So we want to pursue truth, but we want to do that with grace, and we want to do that with generosity. And there is that sort of dance around saying, well, yeah, there's a commonality at least. I said we talk past each other, but also, as Mustafa said, we actually, Muslims and Christians have far more in common worldview-wise than many others in the world. So, yeah.
And even, I would say, Mustafa, a lot of people are simply ignorant of the fact that Muslims and Christians do share a certain set of beliefs, at least, about Jesus, in terms of his messiahship and the virgin birth and that kind of thing. That these things are there as well in the Islamic traditions. But let's get to the nub now of some of the big claims you make in the book. I mean, specifically, I think you say there's a difference between the Jesus that Paul kind of developed in Christian tradition and the Jesus that James and the early disciples, the first followers, if you like, in Jerusalem, took on, the Jewish Jesus, if you like. So tell us about that and why you think Islam somehow connects back into that earliest stream as far as you're concerned.
Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, I should say that who was the true historical Jesus? Who was the true historical Muhammad? There's always a bit of element of faith in that. I mean, as a Muslim, I believe Prophet Muhammad received revelation in a cave in Mecca in 610. There's no way to prove this, right? There's nobody was there, and it's a matter of faith. But is it a reasonable faith or not? People can discuss that. And I think that is true for every religion. Do you believe that Moses heard God, on Mount Sinai? I mean, it's a matter of faith. What I found intriguing in Christianity is that, I mean, as a Muslim, I grew up Muslim. So I learned about Jesus first from the Quran, right? I mean, first from the teachings of Islam. And we all learned that, he was a great prophet, but, Christians exaggerated him and turned him into divine, and that was wrong. But, but we still respect Jesus deeply, and so on and so forth. That's the standard image Muslims have. What I found intriguing was that there's a whole literature on historical Jesus by secular Western scholars, let's say. And I sometimes don't fully share their excessive, maybe, secularism of, boiling down everything to material facts and so on and so forth. But they are talking about different branches in early Christianity. And it is a fact that there were people called Jewish Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Ebionites and Nazarenes, and we know from the church fathers. These were Jews who take Jesus as the Messiah, but just like as Orthodox Jews would accept a Messiah today. So not as a divine figure, but still a divinely sent person to redeem the children of Israel and the broader world. So there were Jews like that. And there is a theory that the earliest Jerusalem church, led by James, was on that path, that they had a difference between what later became Pauline Christianity. And is that difference between what became Pauline Christianity and the Jerusalem church clear? Well, it is clear in the New Testament, at least in terms of whether you obey the Jewish law or not, whether you still preserve the Jewish law, whether you eat with the uncircumcised. And we can understand from the Acts that there's a gap, there's a tension between Paul and the Jerusalem church. It's settled, but it comes back again. Now, does that also reflect a theological gap? My sense is that, and I pointed to that, but ultimately, I understand that a Christian can say, well, the identity, the mystery of Jesus unfolded in time gradually. And the doctrine of Trinity was not pronounced in Judea right after Jesus' death, but it was pronounced later. So we gradually understood the full truth, and so that is one way of understanding early Christianity. I respect that. I think most Christians understand that way. Another way of understanding is that, well, that was not the original thing, but it developed later, and maybe it was not fully reflecting the original thing. And there are certainly Jewish Christians who thought like that. So I'm finding it's very interesting that their theology is reflected almost identically in the Quran. And of course, that has been noticed by some scholars and who said, oh, maybe the origin of Islam is in Jewish Christianity as a totally historical connection. So I discussed that in the book as well. So I really didn't write the book to refute Christianity. As Richard says, I didn't write to refute Mustafa. I just wanted to say, well, as a Muslim, I find this early Christianity quite interesting, and this specific strain in early Christianity interesting. To me, that is more appealing. But I don't think that Paul was doing something that he didn't believe in, or as some Muslims or even some Jews have claimed later. So I just want to emphasize that.
Okay, that's really, really helpful to sort of set out your case there. So what are some of your responses to this, Richard?
Oh, well, just again, the big picture where Mustafa started in his case. I agree with him. For me, Jesus is a really interesting test case in a discussion between Islam and Christianity, because there are so many doctrines, philosophies, metaphysics that are sort of untestable. It's hard. The discussion around whether God is Trinitarian or the sort of Unitarian God of Islam, the metaphysics around that is complex, and we talk about things like the Judgment Day or Jesus' role there. We have very little access to that. Even as Mustafa said, the mystical experiences of the prophet, we weren't there. There were no witnesses. Jesus is a very interesting test case because there were many eyewitnesses. There were sort of concrete historical events. And Mustafa's right. There were ways of, do we have direct access? No, we're relying on eyewitness testimony. Yes, but we've got a lot of material to work with. So that makes it a fascinating case. I guess the sort of fundamental question I have about Mustafa's narrative, the early church narrative, is yes, there were early sects within early Christianity. There were Jewish sects. There were legalizing sects. There were some who wouldn't accept Jesus' divinity. I think that's true. That's just early church history. There were groups like the Ebionites. The Ebionites seem to be a real people. The really critical question here is just how significant were these groups? And is there any sort of plausible way that we can say that this was the true Christianity or the core Christianity? And particularly, is there any way that we can meaningfully align James and the Ebionites? And that's where I think it's a stretch. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. But I just don't think that it fits the story. It doesn't fit the sort of the way that the New Testament developed. Here's the really interesting thing. Doesn't even seem to fit Muslim tradition. So, there's some parallels. Obviously, Muhammad refused to accept Jesus' divinity, so because he was a strong Unitarian around God. But early traditions in the Sirah, for example, the biography of Muhammad, described the dissemination of the Gospels in exactly the same way that the New Testament does. It doesn't make a division between Paul and James, or between Gentile Christianity and Jewish Christianity. That's the beginning of a response. It doesn't seem to me to fit. The narrative doesn't seem to work. Yeah,
it'd be interesting your response to that, Mustafa.
Of course, early Muslims didn't know much about James or the Gospels and so on and so forth. Early Muslims knew what was Christianity around them. And actually, the early Muslims knew some traditions that later got forgotten in Western Christianity, but got preserved in Eastern Christianity, like some infancy Gospels. There are stories in the Quran about the baby Jesus, Mary being raised in the temple, Jesus like breathing into a clay and making birds out of it. So those stories are both in the Quran and some apocryphal Eastern Gospels that didn't make its way to the New Testament. The thing is, one thing on the Ebionites themselves are taking the position that James is ours, but Paul got wrong. So maybe Ebionites were making this up again. So this is, but interesting that there are these Jewish Christians. Why did we call them Jewish Christians? Because they were practicing Jews. And regarding the Ebionites, we know that they were strictly Unitarian Jews, as Jews are still today. And on that sense, Islam actually is fully on the same side with Judaism when it comes to the nature of God. But they highly revered Jesus, and they took Jesus as the expected Messiah. And we know these people lived in the 2nd, 3rd century. Now, maybe they were later a splinter group that exaggerated the difference between Paul and James, and maybe they made it up. So that's one way of looking into this. That would more affirm the Christian, mainstream Christian view. Maybe they were pointing to something real. That's another version. I just wanted to put it there. And to me as a Muslim, it sounds interesting and appealing, but I didn't claim to say I was there and I figured out the whole truth.
And how would you draw the line, as it were, between those Ebionite, that tradition that you say, you know, perhaps is aligned with James and the Jerusalem church, and Muhammad, you know, 7 centuries later? What's the how did it, you know, Muhammad come to know that particular strain rather than the more, you know, generally accepted, you know, if you like, Pauline version that you think won the day in the end?
Mm-hmm. Well, the faith-based answer to that question would be God told Muhammad, and through revelation, of course. But if you want a historical answer, that is the, you know, theme of the chapter in my book called The Missing Link. We know that Jewish Christians, I mean, we don't know, but we don't hear about Jewish Christians anymore after the 4th century because they were a Jewish sect ultimately. And Judaism was marginalized, and Christianity grew in Rome and became the world religion that it is today. And Judaism remained a very small set of people. And among Jews, they were a heretical sect as well. So Jewish Christians were heretical from both points of view. So they probably disappear. We don't hear about them anymore. And what happens is that their view about Jesus, which is a prophet, a Messiah, but not divine, and also a theology that emphasizes acts versus merely being saved by grace, a distaste towards the Pauline perspective on law, you know, that because Paul thought law was not valid anymore for the Gentile Christians at least. So that kind of understanding re-emerges in 7th century Arabia. And I'm not the first person to notice this. Some, you know, 19th century Jewish scholars say, oh, maybe Muhammad got the idea from there. So I look into that. There are some interesting rock inscriptions in the Negev desert that just preceded Islam and which seems to reflect the Jewish Christian theology. So there are hints like that. So one could, from a very secular point of view, could I think make the case that maybe Jewish Christianity was still alive when Islam emerged in 7th century Arabia, and maybe that got reflected. That's one way of looking to it.
Okay. It's
or
an interesting,
you can just say, or you can say, a Muslim can say, of course, you know, God just gives the revelation to whomever he wills, and that solves all the problem there. Or one could even say, well, if you were a 7th century Semitic monotheist prophet who respected Jesus, naturally you would come to that point of view. So even if without a historical link, but intuitively, that would be Islam's take on Jesus.
Yeah. What do you make of all this, Richard? And do you think that there is a valid potential historical link between this Ebionite James early church Jerusalem version, if you like, and Muhammad and what he said had been revealed to him?
Well, it's certainly one of the critical questions in this conversation is where did the Muslim Jesus emerge from, and where did Muhammad, where did he come up with his Christology? That's an excellent question. Maybe a step back and then I'll address that directly. The idea that there were sort of two branches of Christianity, or two senses of Christianity, if you like, Jewish and Gentile, or Jerusalem and Roman. The story is more complicated than that. So it's not like we only had James and Paul. We also had Peter. The New Testament is made up of, well, they're all Jews for a start, so all Christianity was Jewish. But we had Peter, and Peter was in a different place, also preaching a divine Christ. Also, interestingly, Peter was regarding Paul as a genuine apostle as well. We also had John. So there were different Christian communities who were all Trinitarian. So it's not simple as, well, we had James and we had Paul. And Paul was very enmeshed in all those communities. We get those from the same text that Mustafa's drawing on. So I think early Christianity was, it wasn't just these two centers. As for Muhammad, there's a really interesting story in the Quran where people Muhammad sort of comes back and responds to the accusation that his material is not original. And he was being accused of getting his material from a monk. And he comes back and there's this bit in the Quran where it says, no, I'm not getting it from a monk. It's a direct revelation. But it seems to me that the simplest explanation, if you like, is that, yeah, of course there was Christianity around Muhammad. He was a trader. He'd met many Christians, met many Jews, and he'd heard many oral stories about Jesus. It's fairly clear that he'd never read a Bible. I mean, the traditions say that he was illiterate, but also there wasn't really an Arab Bible at the time. But he'd heard stories. And it seems to me the simplest explanation is he'd heard stories, including from the sources that Mustafa mentioned before. He just couldn't bring himself to accept Jesus' divinity. So it's really interesting that the Jesus we see in the Quran, there is nothing original there, if you like. It's really just the Christian Jesus with some objectionable bits taken out that Muhammad didn't seem to be able to accept, like Jesus' divinity and his atoning death on the cross. And Muhammad's not original in that. Many people have struggled to accept Jesus' divinity. Again, as Mustafa said, early Jewish people could accept Jesus as Messiah, but struggled with the divinity. That seems to me a more natural sort of narrative of how it came, rather than some sort of unknown link.
We're going to go to a quick break and we'll be back. My guests on Unbelievable today are Mustafa Akyol and Richard Shumack. We're talking about the Jesus of Islam and Christianity, asking, can we reconcile the two?
What I want to invite Roger to comment on is, why couldn't the mental realm include an infinite consciousness?
It's too much like us. It's too much like
him.
Putting it like, yes, like the Greek views of the gods in some sense. They were like too much like
but
us.
They were finite and contingent. Here we're talking about a metaphysically necessary source.
I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge.
It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle.
If the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not?
I don't think it's a story that's made by committee. Am I going to have a later literary genius who comes up with a great story like this? Or am I going to say, no, Jesus is the genius, and somehow that story has basically been preserved?
Welcome back to Unbelievable, the show that aims to get you thinking every week. I'm Justin Briley. My guests today are Mustafa Akyol and Richard Shumack. We're talking about the Jesus of Islam and Christianity. And just in that last part, we were talking about the fact, Mustafa, that Richard says, frankly, when he sees the way Muhammad thought about and the way the tradition goes in Islam about Jesus, he sees someone who was picking up oral stories about Jesus, but just couldn't bring himself to believe in this divine Jesus. And so that's what you get, rather than it being necessarily linked to these early traditions or of Jewish Christianity and so on. This thing that's a bit far-fetched historically, I think. So I'd just be interested in you, maybe if you're happy to defend a little bit more your thesis, or just how you'd respond generally to what Richard had to say there.
Well, again, my thesis is that the theology of Jewish Christianity is reflected in the Quran. How do you explain that? I gave, well, there are options. I mean, you choose wherever you want. I said you can believe in a historical connection. You can believe in an intuitive connection, which is, as a Semitic Arab prophet, who wanted to respect Jesus, that was the best way to look into the matter. You could say that. You could believe in a divine revelation, which is, of course, a matter of faith. So it depends. And there are parts in the book I said, well, this is how probably Muslims will see this, and this is how Christians will probably see this. And Jews can look at us and say, wow, look at our religion, how it's really complicated the world after us, and they can say that. So there are different ways of looking into this. And again, I mean no disrespect to Jewish theology or faith, and I understand where it's coming from. In the book, I also wanted to look at some point, like, I honor Paul for de-emphasizing law, but emphasizing the notion of conscience, which I think is very important, for example, for religious traditions still today. So I'm not trying to really demonize Pauline Christianity at all. It's just not the tradition that I share. And to me, it's intriguing that there are strains in Christianity that are a little bit different and that are a bit closer to Islam. Is it simple as just Jewish Christianity versus Gentile Christianity? No. Even in Gentile Christianity, you had Arianism. Every Christian knows that, the Arian heresy. I mean, these were the Gentile Christians who didn't fully believe in the divinity of Jesus. That theology reemerged during the Protestant Reformation, which went all the way to Unitarianism. Again, some Christians didn't fully believe in Jesus. Even among all the Gentile Christians who believed in the divinity of Jesus, there were bitter disputes about how do you exactly, define the man. And so this is a complicated topic. And that is one reason towards the end of the book, I'm saying something else. I'm saying, hey, listen, what is the exact nature of Jesus? Even Christians didn't fully, agree on that in history. We Muslims discussed the nature of the Quran in a similar way. Like, was that pre-existent with God, or did that got created at some point, and so on and so forth. But I say, regardless of the differences between the nature of Jesus, nature of Christ, we can also look into the teachings of Jesus. And there are things that we can all learn from, whatever our theology is. And that's why I have a chapter at the final chapter in the book titled, What Jesus Can Teach Muslims Today. Because I find the critiques, the critiques I read in the New Testament towards the Pharisees, towards the scribes, towards the Jewish clergy at the time, by Jesus, a Jew himself, very relevant to some of the more reformist Muslims are today saying about.
And from that point of view, and I'd like Richard to comment on this as well, would you say your thesis about Jesus is also controversial among some parts of Islam as well? Because presumably you give quite a lot of credence potentially to texts that Muslims would say are corrupted, or and so on.
Well, is my thesis a little bit controversial, heretical from the Islamic point of view? Not heretical, but I'm saying a few things that are not going to be accepted by all Muslims. Okay. I mean, I try to substantiate them from within the Quran, but not all of them will be easy. One thing, I'm saying that we Muslims should take the New Testament, the Bible, and especially the New Testament, seriously and read it and study to learn about Jesus. And actually, one reason, the fact that I argue that there is a way of learning about Jesus without accepting the Trinitarian theology gives us a room to read New Testament as Muslims without, really buying into the full mainstream Christian theology. So I'm saying, because the common Muslim knowledge about Jesus comes from what the Quran says about Jesus. But the Quran itself, in a few places, refers to the Bible. Sure. So I'm saying there is a whole literature there. We should go learn about it. We should read it. We can interpret it differently than what mainstream Christianity has interpreted at times, as Jewish Christians probably did in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. And from that, we can know more about Jesus, and that knowledge can give us a perspective. Is this going to be accepted by every Muslim? Not. I got some criticism for this. Also, I'm calling Muslims to be a bit more open to concepts like the Son of God. Again, that's not going to go very easy for every Muslim community. But I'm saying these things, but while showing the basis for that in the Quran.
Great. Yeah, just to be interested in some of your responses to that, Richard.
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing I want to say is that, of course, early Christianity, it took Christians a long time to try and wrap their heads around what it meant for Jesus to be divine and human. There are major sort of philosophical, metaphysical questions around that are they're perplexing. That's a true thing. But from day one, Jesus was worshipped by Christians. And here's a really interesting thing. From day one, there was never a time when the church did not do communion, did not do the Eucharist, didn't remember that Jesus' body was broken for them and that his blood was shed for them. So the cross, the idea that Jesus was an atoning sacrifice and was worshipped has been there at the heart. So yeah, of course it's complex to work out the person of Jesus, but the idea that Jesus was worshipped and that he was, again, the death and resurrection, that was been central. It's been central from the beginning. That didn't take hundreds of years to work out. And that's the heart of Christian Christology, really. The other thing I want to say is that parallels between the Muslim Jesus or the Jesus of the Quran and Jewish Christianity, it's not like Quranic Christology is thick. It's really very, very thin. There's very little detail. Jesus is mentioned maybe 25 times, I think, in the Quran, but there's very, very little details about the who, the where's, the what's, his teaching. It's very, very thin. It's even thinner, by the way, in Jewish Christianity, particularly the Ebionites. We know almost nothing about what the Ebionites believe. There's just only two very small references in the early fathers. Very, very thin. So it's not like Muhammad needed a lot of dependence on Jewish Christianity to come up with the Jesus that's in the Quran. It seems to me, again, more plausible that he was encountering, and there were Orthodox Christians, the Byzantine, he was part of on the fringe of the Byzantine Empire. That's the Jesus he was hearing about, and that's the Christology he just couldn't accept.
And yes, go ahead, sorry.
I agree with Richard that what the Quran says about Jesus is very thin. It's not a big, there are remarkable chapters about the birth of Jesus, especially. The virgin birth. Sure. Maybe more about Mary than Jesus himself, actually, the Quran. Yeah. The Quran doesn't say anything about the mission and the life of Jesus. So you hear nothing about Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion. It's not there. There's even something that looks like a denial of crucifixion, but I'm looking into it. Is it really that simple or not? But it's many Muslims think crucifixion didn't take place, which, by the way, resonates with some early Christian heresy called Docetism. But that's another interesting, just coincidence, if you will. And again, it depends on how you interpret it. That is precisely why, though, I'm calling on fellow Muslims to read the New Testament. The Quran also, for example, just mentions Job in passing. It says, he had a sickness and what? It's just one verse. But there's a whole book there in the Old Testament. And the thing is, early Muslims, because of these references, actually read the Bible. There emerged a whole literature called Israeliyat, which means learning from the Jews. Jews were more accessible at the time, and Jewish sources, and beyond the Bible, Talmud and other sources and other Jewish texts as well. So there was this time that Muslims realized that they are just yet another branch in the big monotheistic tree, and they can learn from the sources. The differences will be still there, but you can have a better understanding. Unfortunately, we lost that. And then Islamic thought became more insular, especially in the modern era. It's become, us versus them, us versus them. So one thing I want to break is that, there's a different way of understanding Jesus and the New Testament, which can allow us Muslims to benefit from the wisdom that I see that is very powerful in the New Testament.
I'm guessing, Richard would agree that there's a lot of shared wisdom potentially. What about his point, though, that in his view, whatever way you cut the way Christology developed over time, potentially from day one, he says, you had a community that worshipped Jesus, that celebrated his atoning death on the cross and believed in his resurrection, all of which in a sense is not in Islam, arguably. So for him, there's a big disjunct there between what early Christianity was fundamentally at its core and Islam. And for him, that I'm assuming that's a big problem to say that somehow Islam does have the correct view when it's so different to early Christianity in that way.
Richard is right that Pauline Christianity emphasized these theological concepts from the very beginning. But when you read the letter of James, you don't see any emphasis, any mention of crucifixion. when you read the letter of James, I mean, he mentions himself as the brother of Lord Jesus, but besides that, it's all about observance of the Jewish law, and so there could have been a Christianity in Judea by people who were still practicing Jews. And even think it this way, I mean, I'll grant that the divinity of Jesus was right there from the beginning, and that was the truth. But even there, these were practicing Jews. And in Judaism, there is absolutely no idea that God will be incarnated. And on that, Islam and Judaism are totally on the same page, still today as it was there. And I basically believe that Islam is by and large a Judaic, religion, in the sense that it is a very Semitic monotheism, but there's a clear gap between men. And so even if the truth of Christianity was exactly what Paul defined, it is conceivable that early Jews who accepted him as the Messiah accepted him as an Orthodox Jew would accept the Messiah today. And I think it's interesting that in the letter of James, besides just the mere mention of Jesus as Lord, there's no crucifixion, there is no...
Well, I'd be interested in your perspective on the book of James. That obviously is important here for Mustafa, and the fact that he feels it doesn't have the same sort of Christology or focus on the crucifixion or resurrection. And even most Christians know that James has traditionally been the book about the way that faith without works is dead, and so on. So go ahead on that, Richard.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with more than just that. I agree with what was said before about clearly early Jewish Christians had major trouble sort of wrapping their heads around, well, what do we do with the law? How do we reconcile the law with the sort of grace that's described in the gospel? Most of the New Testament letters are trying to wrestle with that. Like, it was clearly a major theological crisis, if you like, for the early church, trying to wrestle with that. It was a big thing for Peter, actually, too. And again, let me repeat that I'm sort of uncomfortable with talking about just Pauline Christianity. There's Petrine Christianity, if you like. There's Peter Christianity. There's Johannine Christianity. And they, too, had an Orthodox Christology. I think that's a true thing. James, yes, you see in his book, and this is correct too, there's been various Christians, I think he mentions Martin Luther, who struggled, who found that James, even when I was at Bible college, the principal of my college said, when he was a young Christian, he thought, what's James doing in there? Because it feels quite different. It seems more like a sermon. It's more of a homily, and it's much less theological, much more practical. And yes, the Christology is certainly not overt in James, but it does talk about Jesus as the Lord and the Messiah. It's Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And as a Jew, James will have a whole lot of sort of theological, unlike Islam, by the way, which has very little theological understanding of what a Messiah is. It's a very contested idea in Muslim theology over the years. But for James, a good Jew, he will understand the messianic prophecies in Isaiah about suffering servants and things like that. So there'll be a lot of meaning just in that, even just in that term Messiah. But he calls Jesus the Lord, and the Lord is mentioned all the way through. And maybe he could be meaning the Lord God and the Lord Jesus in some sort of different way, but there's certainly nothing in James that contradicts a high Christology. And again, assuming that he has a sort of a fully orbed understanding of the Messiah, then there's no problem there. There's no contradiction. It's a very, very practical book. That is true.
I mean, what I do hear from a lot of modern Muslim apologists is this claim, I don't know what you think of this, Mustafa, that effectively Christianity got corrupted by those who, invested it with a divine Jesus and so on. Now, is that your view, or do you say, no, it's just it went in different directions, or what?
I don't see any conspiracy in all this. And I'm sure Paul was very honest and sincere. I mean, he suffered so much to defend and propagate in Christianity. And I'm not blaming any historical character here. And I think religious people even today in the past, those kind of religious people are generally honest in what they're believing. And there are a lot of gaps we can't fully know. And again, to our Christian audience here, I respect the Christian faith, and I have full respect to the fact that Paul defined Jesus as he understood from a metaphysical experience, and that developed in the Gentile Roman world. Scholars speak of something called the departing of the ways. There is this, Christianity was born within the framework of Judaism. It ultimately became a new religion in itself. Maybe it was destined to be, and that was the truth. Maybe it wasn't. It depends on what we're looking at, but it happened. What I think is that departing of the ways was not just with Judaism, but what would later become Islam as well. And in the sense of it was departing from the strict Semitic theology of a Unitarian God, and also the notion of a legal religion. And I'm on the Semitic side of this divide, strong Semitic side of this divide. But, I'm looking into it and I say, okay, well, there's some wisdom there too. I want to also honor that. I think there is some wisdom, as I said, in the fact that religion should not be boiled down to blind observance of a law. It can lead to hypocrisy. It can lead to rigidity. It can lead to forgetting what's all about. And Jesus makes an emphasis, and I think Paul took it to maybe new heights. And I wouldn't go that far, but I understand. And then Christianity became what it is, the greatest religion of the world as it's today. And we Muslims and Christians live in the same world. Islam is the second greatest religion, so we all probably make up more than half of humanity for sure. And I think it's time for, there are a lot of Muslim books, the big great conspiracy, Paul was a Roman agent and stuff like that. I think that's all nonsense. And we should understand that. On the other hand, Christians should understand that when Muslims cannot accept Trinity or have a problem with these, well, Jews can't accept too. So there is a certain understanding of God, and it's because of a respect to God. And maybe Jewish Christianity will give us a middle path, which is short of Christian theology, but also not as strict as what Semitic tradition is, because they obviously were followers of Jesus. So we should think on that, and that's why I didn't want to write this book as a polemical book. If it came out like that, that was not my intention, but as a book which both Muslims and Christians can read and say, those guys maybe know something also.
Yeah. So I think Mustafa sees this as building bridges rather than trying to disprove, Orthodox Christianity or anything like that. Richard, what's your take on that?
No, absolutely. And yes, Mustafa, have no fear. Your book did not come across as polemical or anything like that. It was a very bridge building, and particularly now as someone who engages with Muslims in academia and even just in the public square, I appreciate your methodology and your just the tone that which you come in. It's gracious, it's generous, it's brilliant. I think that's one of the great things about the book. So yeah, I think that's right. I guess my question is to what degree do we need a sort of a common doctrinal thread in order to have that conversation well? That's the critical thing. Seems to me that if we're going to have to agree on various doctrines before we can get along as friends, that seems to be a sort of a very high bar. I'm thinking, you have to check it. I'm guessing you like football, soccer, round ball football.
Yeah, I do.
Right. So I'm from Australia.
The real football that's played with the foot.
Right. Whereas I'm from Australia, where we play real football, which is shaped like that. So
okay. And you hold it with the hand, right? That's a more metaphorical one. Yeah. Mine is more literal. Yeah.
Right. Occasionally kick it.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously, I'm not going to force you to agree with me before we can become friends. There are so many things where the common ground for us can't be that we have a love of those things in common. We're going to have a deeper commitment to being friends, I think. And I think that's the thing. What are the grounds for being able to get along well and not just having cordial conversations, but even that's too low a bar for me. I want to know, how can we be friends? How can we be close and embracing and still being able to disagree? And we're in a world, and this is again why I love Mustafa's approach, we're in a world now where if I don't agree with you, if you're not in my tribe, if you're not in my camp, then I can just get angry at you. I can yell at you. I can divide from you. So yeah, I love the idea that we can be close and friends without agreeing.
Yeah, a bridge doesn't just unite two things. It brings them closer, but there's still a gap, but you can walk through, go back and forth. So
right.
In the book, one thing I wanted to do was to tell Muslims, well, you know, we don't agree with the Christians, but at least we should understand that they're coming from something. Like one thing, the Quran calls Jesus the Word of God. Now, if you know Christianity, that is a very powerful definition. Muslims read it, just pass it. What does it mean, Word of God? Few Muslims thought about that. Oh, it means only God created him with the word be. But maybe it's more than that. Nobody is called Word of God in the Quran. So,
right.
And here's something too. So maybe Christians are onto something here. Some Muslims thought about that. And, you know, I quoted them in my book. Muslims are horrified by the notion son of God. But we call Abraham Habibullah, which is the friend of God. We call Prophet Muhammad the lover of God. And so maybe, you know, it's a term that we could at least not be freaked out and try to understand. Yes, we don't accept the divinity part, but we can have a conversation on this and we can understand where the Christians are coming from. On the other hand, I think Christians should understand that, well, Muslims are not worshiping a strange deity. It's the God of Abraham. And its strict monotheism is right there, still alive in Judaism. Its legalism is a really extension of Judaism, halakha. Also, it got more complicated because it turned to empire and Sharia became also a very political system. So I wanted to show these bridges. Still, there will be a bridge and I'll be on this side and you will be on that side. But we can walk, we can have a conversation and we can understand each other better, rather than thinking that those people are tritheists or worshiping three different gods or pagans and so on and so forth. That is not the case. The Quran also has strong passages praising the character of Christians as people, regardless of their theology. They are the closest to believers because they have rabbis and monks, and they have priests and monks, and they're not arrogant. So that's in the Quran. A lot of Muslims are not thinking about that. And one thing interesting is that since Islam came later, it is saying things about the religions before itself, right? Just like Christianity came later, so Christianity is saying things about the Jews, the Jews of the time at least. Out of those sayings, some Christians developed an anti-Semitic worldview, which was wrong, and like it was wrong definition and understanding of the world. Today, some passages in the Quran about Jews and Christians make some Muslims turn anti-Christian or anti-Jewish. Again, that's a problem. But those passages can be interpreted differently. One thing, for example, I always emphasize that when the Quran is criticizing Jews, it is criticizing them for not being good Jews. Like we would criticize ourselves for not being good Muslims, for example. So there are passages, and we can understand that. And the gap between Christianity and Islam on the nature of Jesus will remain. But even there are some bridges. Plus, besides that, the teachings of Jesus is a whole universal field from which all religious traditions can learn from.
We'll go to a quick break and come back to you, Richard, for some response as we start to wind up today's show. Thank you very much for being with me. Mustafa and Richard are my guests today. We're talking about the Jesus of Islam and Christianity, and we'll be back in just a moment's time.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Hello, welcome back to the final part of this week's discussion here on Unbelievable. It's the show that brings you conversations that matter with me, Justin Briley. Don't forget, you can get the weekly podcast if you go to the links in the description from today's video, or sign up to the newsletter as well, and you won't miss a thing. We've got a special free ebook as well that you will receive as soon as you sign up to the newsletter, in conversation with some of my favorite conversations with people like Richard Dawkins, Darren Brown, Jordan Peterson, Tim Keller, lots and lots of interesting stuff there. Links to the show and newsletter in the description from today's program. Well, today on the show, we've been talking about the Jesus of Islam and Christianity. Can we reconcile the two? My guests have been Mustafa Akyol and Richard Shumack. Find out more about Mustafa's book, The Islamic Jesus, from the show information today. And I'll also make sure there's a link to Richard Shumack's recently released book, Jesus Through Muslim Eyes. Now, coming back to you, Richard, again, we were hearing some of the reasons why Mustafa feels his book has really served to build bridges, help people to understand and get a new perspective or appreciation, at least, of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so on. That all sounds very good to me. So maybe what are your, why did you have criticisms for the book when it came to your own, and perhaps you'd like to respond to some of what Mustafa was saying there.
Yeah, right. One of the things in my teaching, one of the things that I tell Christians all the time is Muslims, like it seems bizarre to me that there's a sort of a fear and antagonism between Muslims and Christians, because it seems to me that Muslims, in my experience, but it's also for the reasons Mustafa was talking about, Muslims should be the easiest people for Christians to talk to, because we're both theists. We can debate the details of the theologies of God, but we're both theists. We both believe that humans are created to be believers, to be eternal. There's just so many things about the nature of humanity, the desire for eternity, the facing of Judgment Day. If there's anyone that you can have a massive head start in having a conversation about how can you know God? How can you be forgiven by God? How can you enter eternity? Muslims and Christians should be, and Jews, should be able to have that conversation easily, absolutely. And I guess that's the point at which, for me, and this is really why I wrote the book, my book wasn't, again, it was literally not to rebut, certainly Mustafa in particular, but just in general, I'm genuinely interested in the eternity question. And so for me, it seems like a no-brainer that we can do that friendly, and I'm frustrated and surprised when that doesn't happen. But finding out who the real Jesus is, for me, really matters, because you've got these sort of competing visions of how you enter eternity. And the interesting thing about the Muslim Jesus, particularly the one who emerges later in the sort of devotional material, is, and this is, it goes to the point Mustafa was talking about, this sort of legal idea of a religion. And so that Jesus was a mystic. He was an ascetic. He was a very sort of faithful, pious, simple, godly man. And there's a lot to admire in there. But Christianity says, well, no, our piety won't get us there. Our successful religion, our keeping of the law isn't enough. We need more than that. We need an atoning Jesus. We need a savior. Islam has, and Judaism has no savior either. Christianity has a savior. And working out the answer to that question has eternal consequences. And so for me, that's the really interesting thing. And if we can do that graciously, friendly, that's the real conversation I want to have. How can I enter eternity? I don't want to defend Christianity or Islam. I'm not about doctrine per se. I want to know God personally. That's the goal that I'm heading to, and I hope that, and Jesus, both religions say Jesus will be the one meeting you there on that last day. And I think we just need to get straight which Jesus is going to meet us.
That I suppose at the end of the day, it's not just a historical argument. We're not just arguing about nuances here, Mustafa. It's, eternity potentially hangs on this as far as Richard's concerned. So we've got to get it right. We got to know the Jesus, who Jesus really was claimed to be, and the Jesus we'll meet in eternity. So, yeah.
We have to get it right, but if we are goodwill and we're trying, I hope God will show us mercy, I think, even if we get it wrong. That's my kind of trust in God. I mean, in terms of, like, I as a monotheist, Abrahamic monotheist, as I call myself, walking on the Muslim path, Islamic path. I follow Jesus without worshiping him now. That's my motto. And I understand that one can worship him and follow him as well. And I just wanted to reconcile these things too. I'll say one thing: whatever gap exists between Islam and Christianity also exists between Christianity and Judaism. Maybe even more so, because Jesus doesn't have any place in Judaism. There were actually some medieval Jewish texts that was negative about Jesus, but Jews have, of course, grown up, revisited their position on that. And now we have the idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a good thing. Islam, we should speak of a Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, because Islam is very much on the Jewish theology, but just like Christianity, it's a universalistic religion. It doesn't accept the divinity of Jesus, but on the other hand, it is showing immense respect to Jesus. That has some worldly implications. I mean, when Jesus is ridiculed by secularists, Muslims stand up, for Jesus, and sometimes together. I mean, not in wrong ways, like in terms of terrorist attacks or something. I don't condone those. But there have been times that Muslims said, we're protesting this theatrical play that is mocking Jesus. So that is something here. I mean, I think we also, both Christians and Muslims, agree that Jesus was not just some guerrilla fighting the Roman Empire. That's also a popular thesis that is one reason actually I wanted to write this book after Reza Aslan's successful book Zealot. And I said, well, I don't think Jesus really was a zealot, and he was something more than that. With all due respect to Reza, who's a friend and who's written a great book, but he defined a very secular Jesus that I really didn't believe in. And I said, no, there should be a different story. So honestly, those differences are there, those grounds are there, and we live in the same world. Ultimately, we will, after we die, we will all figure out what was the ultimate right theology, and we should just, stick to the one we believe is the truth. And in the meantime, we should respect each other, tolerate each other, learn from each other, sometimes quarrel with each other, but I think that's the healthier way compared to some zealots in our world today, both within the world of Islam and within the world of Christianity or the Western world, who see the other side as an enemy to destroy or to be conquered.
I'm sure that there's a lot you could agree with there as we close up the show today, Richard.
Absolutely. I think that the links between Christianity and Judaism are slightly stronger than Mustafa makes out. I mean, most of the sort of presentation of Jesus as the Messiah, there's all sorts of threads of theological and prophetic fulfillment between the Old and New Testament. But that's a quibble. Leaving that aside, of course, as a philosopher, and sorry to drop a technical word in, but I'm an involuntarist about belief. Like, I think people just believe what appears true to them. And so, I agree with Mustafa. We need an honest pursuit of truth, and we need to sort of run with what appears true to us. But that's actually where disagreement is great, because the more I engage with Mustafa, or with anyone, and having my views challenged and having new evidence presented and new facts, new ways of thinking, then new things can appear true to me. And I think that's one of the things about having this conversation. The more information we can find about Jesus, whether it's historical, theological, devotional, the more we can hear testimonies about the difference that Jesus makes in lives, the more we build up the picture, and the true Jesus can sort of emerge for us. I totally agree. We need an honest pursuit of truth, and yes, and then we're in God's hands.
Great. Thanks so much for being with me, gentlemen. Mustafa Akyol and Richard Shumack have been my guests today. As I say, links to both their books, The Islamic Jesus and Jesus Through Muslim Eyes, from today's show. But for the moment, thank you, gentlemen, for being with me on today's program.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Absolute pleasure. Nice to meet you, Mustafa.
Nice to meet you. God bless you all.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.